The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Queen Camilla walked through the grand corridors with purpose. Her footsteps echoed against the ornate walls, each click of her heels announcing her presence to the staff who quickly bowed as she passed. Today was different from any other day in the palace's long history. Camilla had been planning this moment for weeks, ever since she discovered the hidden financial records in the late Queen Elizabeth's private study. The documents revealed centuries-old traditions of tribute payments from various Commonwealth nations that had somehow been overlooked in recent decades. These weren't taxes or official payments, but ancient ceremonial tributes that symbolized respect and allegiance to the crown. She entered the throne room where several high-ranking officials were already waiting. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood near the golden throne, while the Prime Minister's representatives shuffled through papers nervously. Palace advisors whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with what they knew was about to unfold. "Gentlemen," Camilla announced, her voice carrying across the vast chamber. "Today we restore a tradition that has been forgotten for far too long. The Commonwealth nations will resume their ancestral tribute payments to the crown." The room fell silent. The Archbishop cleared his throat, his weathered face showing concern. "Your Majesty, these tributes were symbolic gestures from a different era. The modern Commonwealth operates on principles of equality and mutual respect." Camilla's eyes flashed with determination. She had spent countless hours studying the ancient protocols, understanding every detail of how these tributes were originally collected and presented. Symbolic or not, they represent the unbroken chain of tradition that connects us to our ancestors. I will not let these sacred customs die on my watch. The palace secretary, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am, the legal implications alone could create international incidents. Many of these nations are now fully independent republics with their own constitutions. Then they will learn to remember their heritage," Camilla replied firmly. "Send word to all Commonwealth leaders. They have 30 days to prepare their traditional tributes: gold, precious stones, cultural artifacts, whatever their ancestors once offered to the crown." The demands she outlined were staggering. Australia was to provide rare opals and gold nuggets. Canada would contribute maple syrup aged in century-old barrels and pristine furs. India was expected to present silks and spices, while South Africa would offer diamonds from their finest mines. Each nation had specific requirements based on historical records that Camilla's researchers had meticulously uncovered. Lord Chamberlain, one of the most senior palace officials, attempted to reason with her. "Your Majesty, these nations contribute to the Commonwealth in many meaningful ways. Their participation in state visits, cultural exchanges, and charitable initiatives already demonstrate their respect for the crown." Camilla turned to face him, her expression unwavering. "Respect is shown through actions, not just words and ceremonial appearances. Our ancestors built an empire through strength and tradition. I will not preside over its decline into mere politeness and empty gestures." As news of the Queen's demands spread through the palace, staff members exchanged worried glances. The kitchen maids whispered about it while preparing afternoon tea. The groundskeepers discussed it while tending to the royal gardens. Even the most loyal servants questioned whether this was wise. Meanwhile, in the palace's security quarters, Captain Marcus Webb, the head of the Royal Guard, was conducting his daily briefing with his team. Webb was a decorated military veteran who had served the royal family for over 15 years. He was known for his unwavering loyalty, impeccable judgment, and ability to remain calm under pressure. "Sir," one of his lieutenants reported, "there's significant unrest among the staff regarding Her Majesty's new tribute requirements. Several department heads have requested private audiences to express their concerns." Webb nodded thoughtfully. He had heard the rumors and witnessed the tension building throughout the palace. "What's the mood among the senior advisors?" "Divided, sir. Some believe the Queen has every legal right to make these demands based on historical precedent. Others worry about the diplomatic consequences. The Foreign Office is reportedly in crisis mode." As the day progressed, Webb found himself increasingly troubled by what he was observing. Phone calls from Commonwealth governments were flooding the palace switchboard. Embassy officials were requesting emergency meetings. The international media had caught wind of the story, and reporters were gathering outside the palace gates. That evening, Webb stood in his private office reviewing security protocols for the upcoming weeks. He understood that his primary duty was to protect the royal family, but he also felt a deep responsibility to the institution of the monarchy itself. The tribute demands were creating exactly the kind of controversy that could damage the Crown's reputation for generations. His personal phone buzzed with a message from his old military commander, now serving as an advisor to the Canadian government. "Marcus, what the hell is happening over there? Ottawa is in complete chaos. The Prime Minister is being pressured to reject the tribute demand outright." Similar messages were arriving from contacts in Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth nations. Webb realized that this wasn't just a diplomatic issue anymore. It was becoming a constitutional crisis that could fracture relationships built over centuries. Late that night, as the palace settled into relative quiet, Webb walked the corridors during his final security check. He paused outside the throne room where earlier that day, Queen Camilla had made her historic announcement. The weight of tradition seemed to press down on him as he considered the gravity of the situation. His mind wandered to the oath he had taken when he first joined the Royal Guard. He had sworn to protect the Crown. But what happened when protecting the Crown meant protecting it from itself? The tribute demands, while perhaps legally justified by ancient law, seemed destined to create more harm than good. Webb thought about the countless Commonwealth soldiers who had fought alongside British forces in 2 world wars. He remembered the stories his grandfather had told him about serving with Australian and Canadian troops, how they had bled together for common causes. The bonds between these nations were built on shared sacrifice, not ancient tribute requirements. As dawn approached, Webb found himself facing an impossible decision. His loyalty to Queen Camilla was absolute, but his loyalty to the institution of the monarchy and the Commonwealth was equally strong. Something had to be done to prevent what appeared to be an inevitable disaster. But what could a simple palace guard do to change the course of history? The next morning brought fresh challenges as Commonwealth ambassadors began arriving at the palace, their faces grim with purpose. The Australian High Commissioner was the first to request an audience, followed quickly by representatives from Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. Each carried formal responses from their respective governments. Webb watched from his security post as these diplomatic meetings unfolded throughout the day. The tension in the air was palpable. Palace staff moved with nervous energy, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in modern royal history. Queen Camilla remained steadfast in her position, meeting each diplomatic delegation with the same unwavering message. The tributes were not optional gestures of goodwill but required demonstrations of allegiance to the Crown. She cited chapter and verse from centuries-old agreements and treaties, many of which predated the modern independence of these nations. The international media response was swift and brutal. Headlines around the world questioned whether the British monarchy had lost touch with reality. Political commentators debated whether this marked the beginning of the end for the Commonwealth as a meaningful institution. Webb found himself at the center of increasingly urgent security briefings as protests began forming outside palace gates. Commonwealth citizens living in London organized demonstrations, many carrying signs declaring their nation's independence from what they called colonial tribute demands. By the end of the second day, Webb realized that the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. The Queen's determination was admirable in its consistency, but the consequences were becoming more severe with each passing hour. Something unprecedented would need to happen to resolve this crisis, and Webb began to understand that he might be the only person positioned to make that something happen. Captain Marcus Webb spent the 3rd morning of the tribute crisis reviewing confidential intelligence reports that painted an increasingly dire picture. Commonwealth governments were not simply expressing diplomatic concern anymore. They were actively considering withdrawal from the Commonwealth entirely, a move that would shatter centuries of cooperation and shared heritage. The Canadian Prime Minister had called an emergency session of Parliament to debate their response. Australia's government was facing enormous pressure from opposition parties demanding a complete severing of ties with the British Crown. Even traditionally loyal nations like New Zealand were questioning their continued participation in Commonwealth arrangements. Webb's secure phone rang with a call from the director of MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence service. "Captain, we need to discuss the security implications of the current situation. There are credible reports of planned protests in at least 12 Commonwealth nations. Some could turn violent." "How serious are we talking, Director?" Webb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Serious enough that we're advising the Foreign Office to consider emergency diplomatic interventions. The Prime Minister is reportedly considering calling an emergency cabinet meeting to address the constitutional crisis." After ending the call, Webb walked through the palace corridors, observing the obvious strain on everyone around him. Senior advisors moved with urgent purpose between meetings. Palace staff looked worried and distracted. Even the usually cheerful kitchen staff seemed subdued as they went about their duties. The throne room had become a constant hub of activity as Queen Camilla continued meeting with government officials, Commonwealth representatives, and legal advisors. Each meeting seemed to strengthen her resolve rather than soften her position. She had assembled a team of historians and legal scholars who supported her interpretation of ancient treaties and agreements. During one particularly tense afternoon session, Webb overheard heated discussions between the Queen and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop was pleading for compromise, suggesting symbolic gestures that would honor tradition without creating international incidents. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop said with obvious frustration, "the Commonwealth was built on principles of cooperation and mutual respect. These tribute demands undermine everything the modern monarchy represents to millions of people around the world." Queen Camilla's response was swift and decisive. "The modern monarchy has become too concerned with being liked rather than being respected. Our ancestors commanded respect through strength and clear expectations. I will not apologize for demanding the same." Webb noticed that even her closest advisors were beginning to show signs of strain. The palace secretary had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking his phone for updates from Commonwealth capitals. The Lord Chamberlain looked exhausted from managing crisis meetings that seemed to multiply by the hour. International media coverage had intensified dramatically. BBC correspondents in Commonwealth capitals reported growing anti-monarchy sentiment. The American media was having a field day, with talk show hosts mocking what they called Britain's return to colonial attitudes. Social media was flooded with hashtags like "number no more tributes" and "number Commonwealth freedom." But Webb's greatest concern came from his own security intelligence network. His contacts in various Commonwealth nations were reporting that the tribute demands were being seen not just as unreasonable requests, but as insulting attempts to reassert colonial control. This interpretation was transforming what should have been a diplomatic disagreement into something far more dangerous. That evening, Webb received a private message from Sir David Richards, a respected former chief of the defense staff who now served as a strategic advisor to several Commonwealth governments. "Marcus, I hope you understand the gravity of what's happening. This isn't just about tribute payments anymore. We're looking at the potential dissolution of one of history's most successful voluntary associations of nations." The message included classified information that made Webb's blood run cold. Several Commonwealth governments were secretly coordinating their responses, potentially preparing a joint declaration of independence from all ties to the British Crown. Such a move would not only end the tribute demands but could trigger a constitutional crisis that might threaten the very existence of the monarchy itself. Webb found himself in an impossible position. His oath of loyalty to the Crown was absolute. But what happened when fulfilling that oath required protecting the Crown from its own actions? The Queen's tribute demands, while perhaps legally justified by historical precedent, were threatening to destroy everything the modern monarchy had worked to build. He began conducting his own quiet investigation into the historical documents that Queen Camilla was using to justify her demands. Working with a trusted contact in the Royal Archives, Webb discovered that many of the ancient agreements she cited were indeed authentic, but they existed in a complex legal framework that had been superseded by centuries of subsequent treaties and independence agreements. More importantly, Webb learned that previous monarchs had deliberately chosen not to enforce these tribute requirements precisely because they understood that doing so would damage relationships with Commonwealth nations. The modern approach had been to accept symbolic respect and cooperation in place of material tribute, a strategy that had successfully maintained the Commonwealth for decades. Armed with this information, Webb requested a private audience with Queen Camilla. It was an unprecedented move for a palace guard to seek such a meeting, but the circumstances were equally unprecedented. The Queen agreed to see him, perhaps curious about what her head of security could contribute to the ongoing crisis. The meeting took place in the Queen's private study, surrounded by the same historical documents that had inspired her tribute demands. Webb entered with formal military bearing, but he knew that what he was about to say could end his career and possibly result in charges of treason. "Your Majesty," Webb began carefully, "I have served the Crown faithfully for 15 years, and my loyalty to you personally is absolute. However, I must share information that I believe is crucial for your consideration." Queen Camilla looked at him with sharp interest. "Speak freely, Captain." Your judgment has always been sound. Webb presented his research about the historical context of the tribute agreements and the deliberate choices made by previous monarchs to allow them to lapse. He explained the intelligence reports about growing anti-monarchy sentiment in Commonwealth nations and the very real possibility of mass withdrawal from the Commonwealth. Ma'am, I believe the institution of the monarchy itself could be at risk if this situation continues to escalate. The Commonwealth has been one of our greatest diplomatic assets, demonstrating that the Crown can evolve and adapt while maintaining meaningful relationships with former colonies. The Queen listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Webb finished his presentation, she remained silent for several long minutes, clearly weighing his words against her own convictions. Captain Webb, you are suggesting that I abandon a legitimate restoration of royal prerogatives because other nations find them inconvenient? Ma'am, I am suggesting that the Crown's greatest strength has always been its ability to balance tradition with practical wisdom. The tribute payments may be legally justified, but enforcing them now could cost us something far more valuable than gold or jewels. Their conversation continued for over an hour, during which Webb presented detailed analysis of the potential consequences of continuing the tribute demands. He showed her intelligence reports about planned protests, diplomatic cables describing Commonwealth governments' growing frustration, and media analysis suggesting that the monarchy's international reputation was suffering serious damage. As the meeting concluded, Queen Camilla made no immediate decision but asked Webb to prepare a comprehensive security assessment of all possible outcomes. It was clear that his information had given her pause, though she remained committed to her position. That night, Webb worked through until dawn preparing the most important document of his career. The security assessment would lay out every possible consequence of the tribute demands, from best-case scenarios to worst-case outcomes that could threaten the very survival of the monarchy. He knew that presenting this assessment would force a moment of truth for Queen Camilla, and potentially for the entire institution of the British Crown. The next day would determine whether diplomatic wisdom or historical precedent would prevail. And Webb understood that his role as a simple palace guard had evolved into something far more significant. The morning of the fourth day brought news that made Webb's assessment even more urgent. The Prime Ministers of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand had issued a joint statement calling for an emergency Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting to address what they termed unacceptable demands that threaten the voluntary nature of Commonwealth association. The crisis had reached a tipping point, and Webb knew that whatever happened in the next few hours would be remembered as a defining moment in the history of the British monarchy. The fourth morning of the tribute crisis began with an emergency security briefing that would change everything. Captain Marcus Webb stood before Queen Camilla in the throne room, holding the comprehensive assessment that had taken him all night to complete. Palace officials, senior advisors, and security personnel filled the ornate chamber, their faces reflecting the gravity of the moment. "Your Majesty," Webb began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "My security assessment reveals an immediate threat to the Crown that requires urgent action." The Queen's expression remained composed, but Webb noticed a slight tension in her posture. "Proceed, Captain." Webb opened his report and began reading the most critical findings. Intelligence services report that Commonwealth governments are now actively coordinating a joint withdrawal from all Crown associations. This is no longer about tribute payments. It has become a complete rejection of royal authority in member nations. The room fell completely silent as Webb continued his briefing. He detailed intercepted communications between Commonwealth capitals, planned joint declarations of independence from Crown associations, and most alarmingly, secret meetings between Commonwealth leaders and Republican groups in each nation. The Australian Parliament has scheduled an emergency referendum on removing the Crown as head of state. Canada is considering similar measures. Even traditionally loyal nations like Jamaica and Barbados are being pressured by their populations to completely sever ties with the monarchy. Lord Chamberlain shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The Archbishop of Canterbury looked grave. Palace advisors exchanged worried glances as the full scope of the crisis became clear. But Webb wasn't finished with his shocking revelations. "Ma'am, there is credible intelligence that several Commonwealth governments have secretly contacted other major powers, including the United States and the European Union, about forming alternative international associations that would replace Commonwealth arrangements." The implications were staggering. The Commonwealth represented one of Britain's most important diplomatic assets, providing influence and relationships that extended far beyond the country's actual economic or military power. Losing the Commonwealth would isolate Britain internationally and potentially trigger a constitutional crisis that could threaten the monarchy itself. Queen Camilla listened to every word with intense focus, her sharp mind clearly processing the implications of each piece of intelligence. When Webb finished his formal briefing, she asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking. Captain Webb, in your professional assessment, what are the options available to the Crown? This was the moment Webb had been preparing for. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing that his next words would either save the monarchy or end his career. Ma'am, there is only one action that can prevent the complete collapse of Commonwealth relations and potentially save the institution of the monarchy from its gravest crisis in modern history. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for Webb's recommendation. Your Majesty must personally and publicly withdraw the tribute demands and offer a formal apology to Commonwealth leaders for what will be characterized as a misunderstanding of modern Commonwealth relationships. Gasps echoed through the throne room. Several advisors began speaking at once, their voices creating a buzz of shocked conversation. The idea of the Queen apologizing for exercising what she believed were legitimate royal prerogatives was unprecedented, but Webb wasn't finished with his extraordinary intervention. He stepped even closer to the throne, his military bearing commanding attention from everyone present. Furthermore, ma'am, the withdrawal must be immediate and complete. Every Commonwealth government must receive personal communications from Your Majesty within the next 6 hours, or we risk losing any opportunity to prevent mass withdrawals from Commonwealth Association. Queen Camilla stared at Webb for what seemed like an eternity. The room remained frozen in stunned silence as she weighed his words against everything she had worked to accomplish over the past 4 days. Captain Webb, she said finally, her voice carrying both authority and genuine curiosity. You are asking me to abandon legitimate royal prerogatives based on the threats of nations that should show proper respect for Crown authority. Webb had anticipated this response and was prepared with his most decisive argument. Ma'am, the greatest royal prerogative is the preservation and protection of the Crown itself. The tribute demands, while historically justified, threaten to destroy everything the monarchy has built over the past century. He gestured toward the windows overlooking the palace grounds where media crews had been gathering for days. Your Majesty, this crisis is not about ancient tribute agreements anymore. It has become a test of whether the modern monarchy can adapt to changing times, or whether it will cling to outdated traditions that alienate the very nations it seeks to influence. The Queen's advisors began voicing their own opinions, creating a heated debate that filled the throne room with unprecedented discord. Some supported Webb's assessment and urged immediate action to prevent further damage. Others argued that yielding to Commonwealth pressure would set a dangerous precedent that could encourage future challenges to royal authority. During this intense discussion, Webb made a decision that would shock everyone present and become the talk of palace staff for generations. He stepped directly in front of the throne, dropped to one knee, and spoke with a passion that transcended his role as a simple palace guard. Your Majesty, I have served the Crown faithfully for 15 years. I have protected your family with my life and would gladly die for the institution of the monarchy. But I cannot stand by and watch that institution destroy itself through stubborn adherence to traditions that no longer serve their original purpose. The room fell completely silent as Webb continued his extraordinary appeal. Ma'am, the Commonwealth nations are not rebelling against royal authority because they are disrespectful or ungrateful. They are responding to what they perceive as an attempt to return to colonial relationships that their people fought to overcome. Queen Camilla looked down at Webb with an expression that mixed surprise, admiration, and serious consideration. No palace guard in British history had ever spoken to a reigning monarch with such directness about matters of state policy. Captain Webb, you are essentially asking me to admit that I was wrong to demand these tributes. Webb met her gaze directly. Ma'am, I am asking you to demonstrate that the Crown is strong enough to choose wisdom over pride, and flexible enough to preserve its influence by adapting to modern realities. For several long minutes, the Queen remained silent, clearly wrestling with one of the most difficult decisions of her reign. The room waited in tense anticipation as she weighed Webb's arguments against her own deep convictions about royal tradition and authority. Finally, Queen Camilla stood from her throne, a gesture that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries of royal authority, combined with the wisdom of a monarch who understood when flexibility was more important than rigidity. Captain Webb, your counsel demonstrates exactly the kind of loyal service that the Crown requires from its guardians. You have shown me that protecting the monarchy sometimes requires protecting it from its own impulses. She turned to address the entire room with regal bearing that reminded everyone why she held the crown. The tribute demands are hereby withdrawn, effective immediately. My private secretary will draft personal communications to all Commonwealth leaders, expressing our renewed commitment to the voluntary associations that make the Commonwealth strong. The relief in the room was immediate and palpable. Palace advisors began moving with urgent purpose to implement the Queen's decision. The Archbishop smiled for the first time in days. Even the usually stern Lord Chamberlain looked visibly relieved. But Queen Camilla wasn't finished. She looked directly at Webb, who remained kneeling before the throne. Captain Webb, your actions today have demonstrated courage, wisdom, and loyalty of the highest order. However, your intervention in matters of state policy represents an unprecedented breach of protocol that cannot be overlooked. Webb's heart sank as he realized that saving the monarchy might have cost him his career and possibly his freedom. Therefore, the Queen continued, I am promoting you to the position of Special Advisor to the Crown on Commonwealth relations, effective immediately. Your first assignment will be to accompany my personal envoys to Commonwealth capitals, to personally ensure that our relationships are fully restored. The throne room erupted in surprised murmurs as everyone processed this extraordinary development. A simple palace guard had not only challenged the Queen's policy but had been rewarded with one of the most sensitive diplomatic positions in the royal household. Within hours, news of the tribute withdrawal was spreading around the world. Commonwealth governments expressed relief and renewed commitment to their associations with the Crown. International media praised the Queen's wisdom in recognizing the changed nature of modern relationships between Britain and former colonies. Captain Marcus Webb, now Special Advisor Webb, found himself at the center of diplomatic efforts to repair and strengthen Commonwealth relationships. His unique perspective as someone who had served both as a palace guard and as a military veteran gave him credibility with government officials who appreciated his practical understanding of both tradition and modern realities. The crisis that had threatened to destroy the Commonwealth instead became a story of how the monarchy could adapt and evolve while maintaining its essential character. Queen Camilla's decision to listen to counsel from an unexpected source demonstrated the kind of flexible leadership that would define her reign. Years later, historians would mark this 4-day period as a crucial turning point that saved the Commonwealth and demonstrated that the British monarchy could still surprise the world with its capacity for wisdom and adaptation. Webb's intervention became a legendary example of how true loyalty sometimes requires the courage to challenge authority in order to preserve it. The palace returned to its normal rhythms, but everyone who witnessed those 4 extraordinary days understood that they had seen something remarkable, a moment when a simple guard's sudden move had indeed left the entire palace stunned and changed the course of royal history forever.